Chapter 13. Soap and Scales. "You did really well," said Morphea when she saw Delilah getting unsteadily to her feet. "Who? How? Where?" gasped Delilah, weaving a little as she picked her way over to where Morphea was standing at the base of a low hill. They were still in the desert, though clearly in a different part. The slippery ground was riven with dips and slopes where pools and bogs, smeared with sickly green sludge around the rim, nestled at the bottom, and the pong of stagnant water lurked in every hollow. "The Wind Lords are like the White Queen of Feldnor, but they're the guardians of Tengah Sharu," Morphea explained. "They agreed to help us, they did what they said they would, and now they've gone on their way." "I think I saw you talking to them last night." "I saw you watching," said Morphea with a knowing, sideways glance. Do you know them?" Morphea shrugged. "I was born in this land. I'm not a failed notion in case you hadn't noticed. I had a big family, lots of nieces and siblings, and all of them nomads. It was too big to cope with a little girl born too small and too early. The Wind Lords were kind and took me under their care, and taught me what I ought to know, even when I didn't listen." Morphea smiled to herself, and Delilah stared. Somehow a few things clicked into place when she thought about how magically gifted Morphea was. Plus the lack of fluffy ears or a tail, which, now she thought about it, wouldn't have suited her at all. Delilah had been practically living with the anti-Tepid revolution ever since the fight with Key, but there was clearly an awful lot she still didn't know. It made her feel like an outsider, but Delilah knew better than to give such low thoughts a foothold. She knew they weren't true. The pair of them stood in silence for a while, the desert air quite still. "So, does that make us distant cousins?" Delilah wondered aloud at length. Morphea started. "Excuse me?" "I think all these guardian beings must be interrelated somehow, aren't they? Even those creepy ones from the Netherworld, the Nether Watchers," said Delilah thoughtfully. "After all, they each do a similar job. My mother's a White Queen, and you were raised by Wind Lords who are also guardians of a realm, so we must be almost cousins," she chuckled. "I was adopted, not born," said Morphea firmly. "I think there's quite a difference." "There you are!" Dominator had appeared from behind a rise in the muddy ground, looking thoroughly disgruntled. "Just leave me lying in the dirt, why don't you? Never mind that I'm your beloved ruler," he complained, staggering too far to the left as he tottered over. "The pleasure is all mine," said Morphea with a withering glare. "Tell me, how much mud are you digesting right now?" "That is none of your concern," said Dominator, keeping his nose high in the air. "I want to know where you've dragged us to." "See for yourself," said Morphea, pointing to the brow of the hill. Dominator and Delilah both scrambled up to the top to see what she meant. "Well, that's no good. We're not even that close," said Dominator dismissively, refusing to let Morphea win. But whether he liked it or not, he was looking at a small town, driven to the edge of a ragged coastline by lazy, grey hills, and hemmed in at the shore by miles of wide sea that poured out from the horizon like a melted painting across more than half their view. "We're at the town already?" gasped Delilah. "Oh, don't encourage her," Dominator muttered bitterly, looking over his shoulder at a very pleased Morphea. "Look at her, all smug like that." "Where's Tepid?" called Morphea, suddenly realising they were missing one of their number. Delilah confessed she honestly didn't know. She hadn't seen him at all since waking up. "Oh, him!" Dominator rolled his eyes. "I almost forgot. He asked me to find you. His lordship went for an explore to get one's bearings, don't you know? But stepped in the wrong kind of mud and now would very much appreciate some assistance." The accuracy of his impression was both cruel and uncanny. It took 10 minutes before they found their second prince as Dominator took his time showing the way. They found him in a smelly piece of land, sagging with saturated mud and immersed in a dull stream. Tepid was up to his armpits in the quagmire, resting his elbows most politely on the boggy ground. He stayed very quiet while they formed a chain to pull him out, but the mud was reluctant to relinquish its royal guest, and they all ended up face first in it at one point or another. Being rather tall, the amount of prints stuck in the bog was not inconsiderable. Dominator had clearly been playing for time, hoping to see just how far Tepid would sink. After spitting out the dirt from between her teeth and managing to escape the clutches of the bog herself, Morphea was, to say the least, very angry. "You are the most unnecessarily long-legged person I have ever had the misfortune of meeting. I should have cut them off," she growled, stalking up and down while Tepid tipped the sludge from his surviving boot. The other had to be abandoned.
"Now, Morphea, I really am—"
"Don't divert the conversation with diplomacy," she snarled. "I am trying to keep the three of you alive crossing this wretched desert. I can very easily stop putting in the effort and enjoy watching what will happen next."
I thought I would clear my head and see where we had arrived. The poetry of the landscape is quite transporting,"
said Tepid innocently. "Poetry of the landscape!" Morphea snatched his boot and threw it at him. "You nauseating Nausean numbskull! Take your silver spoon out of your ears. You're not on a pleasure trip. I know you're here because you don't want to go to that significant meeting. If you're coming along with us on this mission, you had better be as smart as you know you really are. There's nothing clever in being reckless." Dominator stifled a snort and then a gasp as Morphea caught herself, remembering who else had been told that not so long ago. She glared at Tepid a moment longer, then turned on her heel and marched back up the slope, snapping at a sniggering Dominator along the way. Delilah stood beside Tepid, stunned and more than a little scared. She looked nervously at the prince, wondering if he'd ever been spoken to like that in all his silver spoon-fed life. But he continued quietly pulling on his boot, looking as if he had just had a bucket of icy cold but very refreshing water thrown over him. Are you all right?" she asked tentatively. Tepid straightened up.
"On the contrary, Miss Delilah, I have never felt so alive."
The town was made up of one long, wide street that splintered off into a nest of labyrinthine passages. The buildings were similar to the house of the fisherfolk, though perhaps a little larger and more elaborate. A lively sea breeze slapped thick canvas curtains and awnings stretched across the doorways and round the outside of the traders' pitches in front of their homes where they sold their goods. Some of these spun with clinking wind chimes, lanterns and orbs, dangling from the awnings. Others had sizzling, spitting pans whose contents bubbled with enticing vapours that wafted across their path. However, Dominator, Delilah and Tepid decided they had more chance of reaching the ship in one piece if they kept quiet and let Morphea lead on, and had to settle for chewing on a sense of longing as they left the stores behind and made for the sea. Somewhere there must be someone who could lend them a boat in a town like this. But to their dismay, as they reached the outskirts, they found the shoreline empty. There wasn't even a fishing net. They looked left and right, but all that lay along the edge of the town was an unbroken, rocky beach that slid into the sea. Feeling extremely dejected, the four of them trudged back to the line of buildings and crouched against the wall of the nearest house, whose eaves provided some shelter from the drizzle. There were no boats, which meant no way of sailing up the archipelago to find their ship. Their only hope was if the ship came by this route and happened to sail improbably close to the shore, near enough to see four miserable, muddy figures sitting on it. Dominator sneezed again, heralding that it was time they try and find somewhere out of the rain for the night where they might think of what to do next. They plodded back up the street, passing once more the wonderful smells, local gossip, chatter and trinkets. This didn't lift their spirits, as it soon became apparent that despite all its traders, streets and houses, there wasn't any sort of lodging house. Not that they had any way of paying for such luxuries to begin with. All they had was mud plastering them from head to toe and the last of the cured fish in their pockets. Then, over the clamour of the street and the fizzling of rain, Delilah gradually became aware of someone shouting behind them. Looking back, she noticed one of the street sellers sticking their head out from under their awning and calling to them most insistently. When they didn't respond, the seller ducked out from under their stall, trotted swiftly up behind them and seized hold of Tepid. Before the startled prince could say,
"I beg your pardon,"
he was yanked back down the street.
"I believe this is an abduction! Send help!"
was the last they heard him say before vanishing with the swish of a curtain into the street seller's shop. The rain on Morphea began to steam as her ire rose back to the surface. Wheeling back down the street with Delilah and Dominator in nervous pursuit, Morphea tore through the gauzy curtain and instantly found herself in the midst of a violent battle. On one side was the acrid reek of the bog mud that coated Tepid. On the other was a battalion of perfumes, a multitudinous menagerie of floral funk armed to the teeth with fragrant fury. Morphea actually took a step backwards, her eyes watering. Trying to focus through the clouds of fug, she found Tepid seated in the midst of the miasma, silver spoons rammed firmly back in his ears as he was dabbed with colourful essences, lotions and ointments by the soap seller. The seller spotted Morphea and the others and positively skipped with delight. Never, in all their days of catering to the unwashed, had such filthy customers entered their shop. Before anyone could choke through the haze to speak, Dominator had been hauled forwards and smothered in a thick orange clay that smelt like burnt sugar and raspberries. He tasted some, but the flavour wasn't what the smell promised, and he instantly gagged. The happy soap seller scolded him and liberally applied more. "Excuse me," wheezed Delilah. Morphea's rage was pushed past the point of words. "We can't buy anything. We haven't got anything to pay you with." But the soap seller took her empty hands and gave them a good scrub with something rough that made a lot of black bubbles. "Thank you, but please listen. We can't stay and we can't pay you either," Delilah implored, though marvelling at how nice her hands felt as the seller rubbed them dry on a fluffy towel. "Tepid," whispered Morphea, reaching for the oblivious prince with claws of death, but the soap seller slid expertly in between, tutting while they smoothed out Morphea's frown lines with their thumbs. On the second application of the orange clay, Dominator thought the flavour was growing on him, and his eyes started to rove about the shop in search of other soapy morsels. Tepid, meanwhile, was engaged in a deep conversation with the soap seller, who, it transpired, spoke a choice selection of their language, doubtless the result of numerous dealings with other hapless travellers.
"And, what did you say this stuff was supposed to do?"
"Mind-soothing and mild decongestion. Good for nose blockings."
"How marvellous! Isn't it pokey? And this?"
"Eats dandruff," said the seller, lovingly dredging it through Tepid's hair. "What about this?" asked Dominator, standing at the foot of a tall cabinet lined with musty jars and holding one aloft. "Out of date," said the soap seller dismissively. "Very, very old and dud ingredients." Said Dominator, only half listening as he dipped his hand inside the jar. "Is that a good idea?" whispered Delilah. "Let him die," hissed Morphea, as the seller moved back to her and began scraping back the taut fury from Morphea's face in a powerful head massage. They were clearly stronger than they looked. Dominator pulled out one of the dull, disc-shaped objects from the jar and licked it. It tasted like an indistinguishable colour of magic, gone stale. He gave it a second lick. "Very ancient mermaid scales, no good for anything," said the seller, jerking knots from Morphea's hair. Dominator stopped mid-lick.
"Did you just say mermaid scales?"
said Tepid, sitting up straight, bubbles dripping down his face. The soap seller looked around, bemused that all 4 of their customers had stopped struggling and were now staring at them in wide-eyed amazement. "What do you want to knowing?" they said. "Where did you find them? Where can you find more?" said Delilah at once. These are very, very old ingredients. Mermaids are very delicate." "You're not hunting, are you?" asked the soap seller shrewdly.
"Absolutely not,"
said Tepid, blinking soap out of one eye.
"I give you my word. My dear comrades intend to create a potent poison pill sort of thing that will stop this troublesome rain."
"We only need discarded scales," said Delilah earnestly. "Not the mermaids. Can you tell us anything? It's extremely important." It's a lot of private information. What will you be wanting to paying?" said the seller, turning a bar of soap ominously in their hand. It was very late at night before Morphea, Delilah, Dominator and Tepid emerged from the soap seller's shop, gleaming from head to foot and pursued by a flowery aroma that could outlast death itself. They had paid the seller with the most valuable thing they could give, their time. The soap seller had joyfully used every single product they had, explaining in great detail the uses of each one, while they rendered them sparkling clean. They had also taken numerous samples of the mud coating each of them, and cleverly developed an entire new range of products based on the minerals within it. This entire range then had to be tested, of course, and the seller thoroughly enjoyed slapping the results, effectively their old mud, but improved, back onto them one by one. In return, the soap seller confided the story of how their grandfather used to sail out to sea and go diving to record the fish and rare creatures in the waters. He would bring back the mermaid scales and other cast-offs from the peculiar sea-dwelling things to see what they could be useful for. However, others in the town got wind of the promise of magical riches lying on the seabed and began heading out themselves. So, their grandfather left those waters to protect them and spread rumours of far greater things to find in other places. What was in the jar was all that remained of his collection, devoid of any magic and quite useless. The seller added that they were certain mermaids were still lurking around those waters because they had heard news of several small boats, and even a ship, being wrecked very recently in that part of the sea. Mermaids defending themselves were surely to blame. Despite feeling rather cynical about that last part, Delilah and the others couldn't believe their luck as they headed back to the seashore, thinking over the story they'd been told and nibbling on the remnants of their cured fish. Even these were less smelly than they had been before. Huddling under the eaves of the same house they had found earlier, they took it in turns to watch the horizon for the lights of any passing boats, hoping that the next day would bring fresh ideas and maybe a way back to their friends. Alariana found herself in a dark room. She could see, but there was no obvious source of light. All around her was covered in a thick layer of black dust.
Alariana,
a warm voice spoke. She spun round, brushing layers of black dust away with her skirt.
Long time no see.
Key stood in front of her, gently smiling the way she always remembered him.
Key, no. Wait, you're dead.
Alariana could feel her heart rate increasing rapidly. The black dust resettled around her feet.
I am, but I came to visit.
He stepped towards her.
I missed you.
He stepped forwards again.
Stop!
She shouted, but suddenly it was as if her feet were glued to the floor.
What's wrong?
He kept walking towards her, appearing warm and gentle.
Stop! You aren't real. You can't be real. You're not here.
She was screaming and crying now.
I'm here. Isn't that real enough?
He was almost in front of her.
I don't care.
She struggled against the invisible restraints holding her there.
Don't you love me?
No!
Suddenly all was still and quiet.
I don't understand.
I'm not in love with you anymore, Key.
She was trembling.
I stopped loving you. I moved on.
She was sobbing, her head low, her body shaking.
Nonsense!
He lifted her chin.
You're mine.
He was suddenly not the Key she remembered.
No, I'm not.
Alariana, be reasonable.
He was the Key that everyone but her had seen.
I am. And for the first time in a very long time, I am making a sensible decision.
Tut.
He was manipulative.
How cruel of you, Alariana.
He was cold. He gripped hard on her chin.
Stop it.
She struggled, but he gripped harder.
No.
He had always been this way. She had just never seen it.
I said...
Alariana gritted her teeth and began to engage her magic.
Stop!
Ah!
She bit down hard on his hand and used her magic to push him away. She allowed her magic to pick her up and float.
You can't do that!
His hand was bleeding profusely.
You can't use magic!
That's where you're wrong. You see, yes, I can.
She felt calmer now. She was in control for the first time. He wasn't allowed to do this to her anymore.
Key, you listen here and you listen good. I am not the child you manipulated, controlled to bend to your will.
Her magic formed a protective shield as she moved towards him.
I never did that to you. I helped you, guided you.
I thought so too.
The dust moved out of her way.
And then I made real friends, I met real mentors, and felt real freedom.
Alariana, I complete you.
He was frantic.
No, Key. You never did.
A ledge had formed behind him as the room began to fade away.
Key, I've been moving on. And whether you're really here or not, you need to let me go.
She put her hands on his shoulders.
And I need to let you go.
She held him close for a second.
So please, for both our sakes.
Her voice was shaking, but her magic maintained the barrier between her body and his.
Stay dead.
No.
She felt her body move on its own,
No.
pushing Key off the ledge.
No! Ah!
He screamed and cursed all the way as he fell. When he hit the bottom, he erupted into a red light.
Told you weren't real.
Alariana fell to her knees, sobbing before she felt someone shaking her awake.
Alariana!
She woke up with a start. She was back on the ship and Abriam was shaking her.
Are you okay?
Yes, Are you?
Yes, I am, but you've been attacking the crew in your sleep.
What?
Sure enough, as Abriam pulled her up to the top deck for some fresh air, she could see the remnants of her night terror. Abriam stood with her as she took deep breaths, staring over the bow.
Is everyone all right?
Alariana asked, unsure what damage she'd caused.
Most of the crew are resting in their cabins. So far it mostly looks like emotional shock. Nothing physical except for some broken barrels.
That's good, I suppose.
There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable.
Are you sure you're all right?
Abriam said quietly.
You were, sleep-talking.
Sorry, is that what woke you?
No, the crew screaming did that.
Abriam said, half chuckling.
Right. I'm going to have to apologise to them, aren't I?
Yes.
The silence resumed.
You were talking about, Key.
Alariana felt a cold pang in her chest.
Look, I didn't think of it at the time, but, I can only imagine what it must have been like for you.
Abriam had a stern yet sincere look on his face. It wasn't one Alariana was used to seeing on him.
You were in love with him and he died. Twice.
I'm not anymore.
Huh?
In love with him, that is.
The wind whipped Alariana's hair, the coolness of it soothing on her face. Abriam stared at her, tracing the features of her face with his eyes, looking for some sign she was joking. He hadn't realised how pretty she was before.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Abriam held her eyes with his gaze, waiting for her to change her expression, tell him she wasn't serious. Something! But instead she kept looking up at the sky, the light of the ship's lanterns flickering in her eyes. Abriam opened and closed his mouth several times, unsure of what to say or do. Alariana turned her head to face him and smiled a heartfelt smile at him. Abriam took a sharp breath in before he quickly turned his face, his cheeks bright red.
Hey,
A voice echoed.
you two should kiss.
The pair quickly turned towards the source of the unwelcome intrusion into their candid moment. Dangling upside down by his ankle from the lookout point was Morland, arms folded, with a very grumpy red face.
Mr. Morland, are you all right?
Alariana shouted up to him.
Oh, yeah. This is great for my back.
Abriam and Alariana released a relieved sigh. Morland scowled.
Of course I'm not. Get me down, you mini demon.
Sorry.
Together, Alariana and Abriam climbed up to untangle Morland from the lookout point and helped him down.
I'm guessing I did that.
She said nervously when they were safely back on deck.
Nah, it was a flock of seagulls.
Morland shot her an angry look.
She didn't mean to.
Abriam retorted.
Now, let me look at that ankle.
He made some thoughtful humming noises as he felt around it and responded to Morland's yelps of pain.
Hold on. This is going to hurt.
Wait, what?
Morland was cut off by Abrion, pulling his ankle sharply back into place.
You. That feels better now.
It looks like you twisted and dislocated it when you ended up in the lookout point. It's still pretty damaged, but at least it's not sideways anymore. I'll need to bandage and splint it, and you'll need to rest it, unless you want permanent damage.
Right, laddie.
Morland mumbled as he stood up.
I'm really sorry, Mr. Morland. I really am.
Alariana said, shaken by how much unintentional damage she'd done to the poor sailor's ankle.
As you should be.
He snapped.
You should have stopped having fits like that when you were a child. Have you not controlled your magic yet?
Alariana took a deep breath, steadying herself. After a moment's pause, she looked straight back at Morland's accusing face.
My magic is stronger than other people's. I'm doing my best to control it, but because some bad things happened a long time ago, I sometimes struggle. But I'm doing my best, and that's good enough for me.
Morland didn't have a smart answer to that, so had to settle for staying quiet. Alariana turned away and headed back down below. Abrion wanted to call after her, but hesitated. Perhaps there wasn't anything else to say at this time.